In the heart of northeastern Pennsylvania, 80 miles north of Philadelphia, there is a city built on coal. Hazleton? A place where the earth itself was hollowed out to fuel a nation, where generations of immigrant families, Irish, Italian, Eastern European, came seeking something better and found it in the black veins of anthracite that ran beneath their feet. At its peak in the 1940s, Hazleton's population had swelled to nearly 38,000. The mines drew them in, men who descended hundreds of feet into the dark each morning and emerged each evening covered in black dust, carrying home wages that kept families fed and churches full. The coal barons built grand homes on the hill. The workers built row houses in the valleys. And together they built a community bound by labor, by faith, and by the unspoken understanding that you looked after your neighbors because they were looking after you. By 1964, those veins had run dry. The mines that once employed over 13,000 men had gone silent. Hurricane Diane had flooded the deep shafts nearly a decade earlier, and what the storm didn't kill, petroleum finished off. The population was bleeding away as young people left for Philadelphia, New York, anywhere the work still was. The landscape bore the scars of extraction: vast open pits, mountains of waste coal, and strip-mined hillsides slowly being reclaimed by scrub brush and silence. But the people of Hazleton who remained were resilient, these coal country families. They stayed because this was home. They stayed because the churches still rang their bells on Sunday mornings, the shops on Broad Street still opened their doors, and the children still walked to school along the same sidewalks their parents had walked before them. It was a place where people didn't lock their doors, a place where everyone knew everyone, a place that believed, perhaps naively, that its children were safe. On the morning of March 18th, 1964, that belief was shattered forever. Marise Ann Chiverella was 9 years old. She was, by all accounts, a sweet and shy girl. She was learning to play the organ. She dreamed of one day becoming a nun. She was the kind of child who carried canned goods to school to give to the sisters who taught her, which is exactly what she was doing on that cold March morning. It was approximately 8 o'clock when Marise left her family's home in Hazleton. Bundled against the late winter chill, carrying a bag of canned goods she intended to deliver to a nun at St. Joseph's Parochial School. The walk was roughly half a mile, a route she had taken many times before, through the familiar streets of her neighborhood, past houses she recognized, toward the school where her classmates would be waiting. She was last seen at approximately 8:10 a.m. in the area of West 4th and Church Streets, just 10 minutes into her walk, just blocks from home. And then Marise Chiverella vanished. When Marise didn't come home for lunch, her family grew concerned. When it became clear she had never arrived at school that morning, concern turned to alarm. Calls were made. Neighbors were contacted. And then the police were called. In a town like Hazleton in 1964, a missing child was almost unthinkable. This was not the kind of place where bad things happened to children. But as the morning turned to afternoon and Marise was still nowhere to be found, the unthinkable began to feel terribly, sickeningly real. At approximately 1 o'clock that afternoon, roughly 5 hours after Marise had left her home, a man was teaching his 16-year-old nephew to drive on the outskirts of town near the Hazleton Municipal Airport. They were in a desolate area, surrounded by the scarred landscape of old strip mining operations. Vast, open pits where coal had been torn from the earth decades earlier, now abandoned and slowly being reclaimed by scrub brush and silence. In one of those coal pits, they noticed something. At first, the man thought it was a large doll. Discarded, forgotten. It was not a doll. It was Marise. Her body had been dumped in that pit, more than 2 miles from where she had last been seen. The 9-year-old had been sexually assaulted and strangled. Her wrists and ankles had been bound with her own shoelaces. Her scarf had been stuffed into her mouth. She had been discarded like refuse in an abandoned coal pit, in the shadow of a dying industry, in a town that would never be the same again. The murder of Marise Chiverella sent shockwaves through Hazleton. In a community that didn't lock its doors, the idea that a child could be snatched from a sidewalk on her way to school was almost incomprehensible. Parents who had let their children walk freely through the streets began walking their children to school themselves. Doors that had stood open for decades were bolted shut. The old trust, the one that had held this coal town together through decades of hardship and decline, had cracked. The innocence of the community suffered a wound from which it would never fully recover. Hundreds attended Marise's funeral. The church overflowed with mourners, family, friends, schoolmates, neighbors, and strangers united in shock and grief. Maurice was laid to rest at Our Lady of the Rosary Cemetery. But even as the community gathered to say goodbye, a deeper fear had taken root. If this could happen to Marise, a quiet girl walking a familiar route on an ordinary morning, then perhaps Hazleton was not as safe as everyone had believed. The Pennsylvania State Police launched an immediate and massive investigation. Officers fanned out across the city. Hundreds of interviews were conducted. Every lead, every tip, every whisper of suspicion was followed up. In those early days and weeks, there was a fierce determination to find whoever had done this, to bring justice to Marise, to give her family answers. But answers did not come. Weeks became months, months became years, and the case of Marise Chiverella grew cold, not because anyone stopped caring, not because her name was forgotten, but because the evidence of the era was simply not enough. In 1964, DNA profiling did not exist. Forensic science was in its infancy by modern standards. There were no surveillance cameras on street corners, no cell phone records to trace, no digital footprints to follow. The killer had left traces of himself at the scene, evidence that decades later would prove to be his undoing. But in 1964, the science to unlock those secrets simply did not exist. And so the case files remained open year after year. Generation after generation of investigators inherited the Chiverella case. Over the span of nearly 6 decades, more than 230 Pennsylvania State Police investigators would touch this case, each one carrying the weight of a little girl's unsolved murder, each one hoping to be the one to finally crack it open. The family, too, carried their burden. Marise's parents lived out their lives without ever knowing who had taken their daughter. Her mother never stopped praying for answers. Every Sunday, she would bow her head and ask the same question she had been asking since 1964, praying to Jesus and the Blessed Mother, asking them to please help the Pennsylvania State Police find the man who hurt her daughter. It was a prayer repeated so often, across so many years, that it became almost a ritual, a mother's refusal to let her child's story end with silence. Her siblings grew up, married, had children of their own, all under the shadow of a question that had no answer. Ronald, the eldest brother, watched his parents age under the burden of unresolved grief. Carmen, the older sister, held tight to her memories of Marise, the shy smile, the love of music, the quiet kindness that had defined her little sister's brief life. And always there was the question, who killed Marise and why? The not knowing was its own kind of torment, a wound that could never fully close. For 57 years, the streets of Hazleton kept their secret. The coal pits where she was found slowly filled with rainwater and weeds. The school she never reached continued to educate children. Life went on, but the wound never closed. Then, in 2007, something changed. The Pennsylvania State Police DNA laboratory, working with evidence that had been meticulously preserved for over 4 decades, managed to develop a DNA profile. From the biological evidence left on Marise's jacket, evidence left there by her killer, scientists extracted a genetic signature. For the first time in 43 years, investigators had something tangible, a biological fingerprint of the man who had murdered Marise Chiverella. But there was a problem. The DNA profile didn't match anyone in existing criminal databases. The killer's identity remained hidden, and so the investigators began a painstaking ritual. Every month, they would run the profile against newly added entries in the databases. Every month, they hoped for a match. Every month, they were disappointed. This went on for years. 2008, 2009, 2010. Year after year, the monthly checks yielded nothing. But the investigators never stopped checking. They never gave up. In 2018, the investigation took a dramatic new direction. Authorities partnered with Parabon NanoLabs, a company at the cutting edge of forensic DNA analysis. The DNA profile was submitted to genealogical databases, the same kind of databases that ordinary people use to trace their family ancestry. The idea was revolutionary and relatively new in criminal investigation. If you can't find the killer's DNA directly, perhaps you can find his relatives. In 2019, they got a hit. Not the killer himself, but someone connected to him by blood. A distant relative. Perhaps as distant as a sixth cousin. It was, in the vast ocean of human genetics, the faintest of signals. But it was enough. This is where the story takes a remarkable turn. In 2020, The Pennsylvania State Police began working with a young man named Eric Schubert. He was 18 years old, a student at Elizabethtown College, and he happened to be a prodigy in the emerging field of investigative genetic genealogy. Schubert volunteered his expertise on the case. He later said that he knew he could at least potentially get this case a little closer to being solved. It was a modest statement for what would become a monumental effort. Starting from that single distant DNA connection, he began the extraordinarily complex process of building a family tree. He had a list of approximately 2,000 people who appeared to share some ancestral connection with the unknown DNA profile. Using genealogical databases, census records, military records, birth and death certificates, and any other available documentation, Schubert began mapping out the connections between individuals, looking for points of convergence, tracing lineages forward and backward through generations. It was a process of elimination on a vast scale. 2,000 possibilities became hundreds. Hundreds became dozens. Schubert cross-referenced, verified, and eliminated. Branch by branch, name by name. The kind of work that requires both scientific precision and a detective's intuition. And slowly, methodically, over the course of nearly 2 years, the family trees began to converge. Eventually, the genealogical work identified 4 potential suspects, 4 men whose DNA could theoretically match the profile from the crime scene. And one of those 4 men had something the others did not, a history of violent sexual assault. His name was James Paul Forte. James Paul Forte was born in 1941 in Hazleton, Pennsylvania. He lived in the town his entire life. He worked as a bartender and as a bar supplies salesman. And he lived just 6 or 7 blocks from the Chiverella family. He had no known connection to Marise or her family. The attack, investigators would later conclude, was likely random. A crime of opportunity committed by a predator who lived in the same small town as his victim, who walked the same streets, who may well have seen her that morning, carrying her canned goods on her way to school, and made a decision that would destroy a family and haunt a community for generations. 10 years after he murdered Marise Chiverella, Forte was arrested in 1974 on charges of involuntary deviate sexual intercourse, sexual assault, and aggravated assault. Police would later describe the victim's experience in that case as a very violent encounter. But Forte received a plea deal. The charges were reduced to aggravated assault, and he was sentenced to just 1 year of probation. 1 year. For a violent sexual attack. And this was the same man who, a decade earlier, had murdered a 9-year-old girl. In 1978, Forte faced additional charges of reckless endangerment and harassment. And then, in 1980, James Paul Forte died. He was 38 years old. The cause was reportedly a heart attack, suffered at his workplace. He died never having been arrested for the murder of Marise Chiverella. He died never having faced justice for what he did in that coal pit, or so he thought. There was one final obstacle. Forte had been dead for over 40 years. He had died in 1980, long before DNA technology existed in any meaningful forensic capacity. His body lay in a cemetery in Hazleton, silent, decayed, but potentially holding the final piece of evidence needed to confirm what the genealogical research suggested. In January of 2022, investigators took the extraordinary step of exhuming Forte's remains. With the assistance of the Luzerne County District Attorney's Office, they obtained the necessary legal authorization and carefully unearthed his body. Tissue samples were collected and sent for DNA analysis. The comparison was made, and the results came back. The DNA profile from James Paul Forte matched the DNA profile from the semen found on Marise Chiverella's jacket. The statistical probability of an unrelated individual having the same profile was 1 in 480 septillion. For context, that number has 25 zeros after it. The match was, for all practical purposes, absolute. After 57 years, 8 months, and 17 days, the murder of Marise Ann Chiverella was solved. On February 10, 2022, the Pennsylvania State Police held a press conference. The room was filled with investigators, some who had worked the case for years, some who had inherited it from colleagues who had since retired or passed away. Members of the Chiverella family were present. The weight of nearly 6 decades hung in the air. Corporal Mark Barron, the lead investigator, spoke to the gathered crowd. He said, quote, "Over the past 57 years, this homicide investigation has affected the family, the Hazleton community, and hundreds of members of the Pennsylvania State Police. The dedicated and relentless work of all members of this team, and with the assistance of Eric Schubert, we are proud to say this case is solved. Although it doesn't bring back Marise, We hope it provides closure to not only her family, but all individuals affected by this brutal and senseless crime. Carmen Marie Rotke, Marise's sister, addressed the press as well. She spoke of precious memories. She spoke of the emptiness her family would always feel. She said that her parents had sought justice, not revenge, and she concluded with words that carried the weight of a lifetime of waiting. Thanks to the Pennsylvania State Police, justice has been served today. Ronald Chiverella, Marise's brother, offered his own reflection. He said, quote, "Now that we know the individual, it gives us a sense of closure. No full closure. We'll never have that, but a sense of closure that we know the individual that did it, and that the individual isn't out committing the same crime and hurting other young girls like Marise." The resolution of the Marise Chiverella case stands as a testament to several things. To the relentless dedication of law enforcement officers who refused to let a little girl's murder be forgotten. To the advancement of forensic science, which turned evidence from 1964 into an identification in 2022. To the extraordinary contribution of a young college student whose expertise in genealogy helped crack open a case that had defied investigators for generations. But it also stands as a reminder of the imperfect nature of justice. James Paul Forte never sat in a courtroom. He never heard a guilty verdict. He never spent a day in prison for what he did to Marise. He lived another 16 years after the murder, walking the same streets as her grieving family. He committed further acts of violence against others, and when he died in 1980, he took his secret with him to the grave, or so he believed. The science caught up. The truth came out. But the question remains, is it enough? Is a name on a press release 57 years after the fact enough to call justice? For the Chiverella family, the answer seems to be, it is what it is. It is not full closure. It can never be full closure, but it is something. It is an answer to the question that had hung over their lives for as long as most of them could remember. It is the knowledge that the man who did this has been identified, that the world knows his name, that the record has been set straight. Police noted at the press conference that Forte may have committed additional crimes beyond those for which he was charged. They asked anyone with information to come forward. Hazleton, Pennsylvania, still stands. The coal pits have been filled or fenced off. The streets where Marise walked have been repaved and renamed. St. Joseph's School continued to educate children for decades after she was taken. The town endured as coal towns do, through hardship and change, through loss and reinvention. But the people of Hazleton never forgot Marise Chiverella, the 9-year-old girl with the canned goods walking to school on a cold March morning in 1964. The sweet, shy girl who wanted to be a nun, who was learning to play the organ, whose life was stolen before it had barely begun. For 57 years, her murder was an open wound in the fabric of this community. A reminder that evil can exist even in the places where people don't lock their doors, that the worst things can happen on the most ordinary of mornings. But the wound at last has a name attached to it now. James Paul Forte. And while that name cannot undo what was done, it has given a family and a community something they had waited a lifetime for. Not full closure. Never that, but something. Rest in peace, Marise.